Hi, and good morning, everyone. My name is Luke Niferatos. I am the Executive Vice President at SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. We're an NGO based in the United States, working on the issues of marijuana and marijuana commercialization specifically. I am joined today by our President and CEO, Dr. Kevin Sabet, a former three-time White House advisor to the Clinton, Obama, and Bush administrations. As well as now an adjunct professor at Yale Medical School, among a wide array of other qualifications and expertise that he provides. He will be introducing us today to our topic on marijuana commercialization, what we've learned from this in states that have allowed a legal marijuana regime. And he's also going to tee us up into the marijuana potency issue, which will be picked up by a state representative from Washington State. We're very grateful to her joining us, Representative Lauren Davis. Thank you for joining us today. You're going to share about, she'll be sharing about some legislation she introduced in her state to address the marijuana potency issue, as well as her general experience with marijuana commercialization and the industry as well. I myself am based in Colorado and will be sharing a little bit about some efforts to address marijuana's potency and commercialization harms in the state of Colorado as well. So without further ado, I'm going to tee up our president, Dr. Kevin Sabet, who will open us up. Kevin.
Thank you, Luke, and your excellencies. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's really wonderful to be at probably our, as SAM as an organization, our 10th Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And for me, when I was representing the White House at this meeting, it's been 15, 16 years. It's been a privilege to be joining you, or even more than that, at the Commission. So we really value the work of the Commission and the work of the United Nations in the field of drug control. We greatly value the 3 international treaties that govern the cooperation around the world on so many issues now, and it has issues that have become so complex. But I think why we wanted to bring you here this morning to hear about what's happening in the United States is that really it's something that is unprecedented, that doesn't really have a similar example in the world. Obviously, there have been other places, other nations that have experimented with different cannabis policies, but really nowhere quite like the United States with the commercialization of cannabis. And of course, this is now happening in almost 24 US states. And it is really, in some ways, a giant experiment, but I hesitate to call it an experiment because an experiment usually means that you are looking at data and changing things as data come in, and you're looking at something from a scientific point of view. But of course, we often are looking at things in the United States from a political point of view, but it's still very, very important we think it's very important to rely on data. And that's why I was also so happy that there were other side events happening. For example, the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy and RAND, our colleagues there with Dr. Angela May from UNODC and Rosalie Pakula from RAND and others, Wayne Hall, INCB, former INCB, doing a really wonderful job there. And we're going to talk in similar veins, but I think provide some new data for you to learn about what we have done. So I'm going to start with a general overview about really what is happening in the United States. So when I can share my screen and become host, I will do that. And I think it's just very important because we're really privileged to be joined by Representative Davis today. And Representative Davis from Washington State is an elected official who comes to us from the world of recovery, actually the world of really standing up for people in recovery from substance use disorders. And she has courageously, as a Democrat in her state, not been afraid to take these issues of substance use disorder and substance use prevention and initiation and treatment and intervention, really take them on head on. So I'm actually very excited to hear from her. But just to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we are dealing with in the United States. First of all, as an introduction, many of you know who we are as SAM. We are a nonpartisan marijuana policy group that does work around the world. We're governed by a scientific advisory board of the top researchers, mainly in the United States. And we are really trying to engage in the media because there's a lot of misconception about cannabis and what's happening in the world today, and especially in the United States. We proudly collaborate with really top medical associations around the and business associations and other public health and safety authorities around the United States. But I think the key message we need to get across is we're not talking about what I would call old cannabis or old marijuana. And for the purposes of this presentation, we'll talk about I'll use the word marijuana. We're not talking about old marijuana. We're really talking about what I would call new marijuana. What is new marijuana? It's things that we've never seen before the last 10 years or 20 years. Packaged edibles, it's packaged oils, it's different ways that we are seeing cannabis or marijuana being ingested. And again, packaged in ways that we have never seen before, often very attractive to children, which is something that we're obviously very concerned about. One of the best analogies that I've heard comes from Jonathan Calkins, who's also a colleague of Dr. Pakula's and many others, really, I think one of the deans of modern drug policy analysis. He talks about the difference between the sort of typical marijuana consumer from 20 years ago versus the typical marijuana consumer today. It's sort of like comparing somebody who used to drink and get caffeine from 120-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola, who now, if the average drinker of caffeine went from 20 ounces of Coca-Cola to 33 Starbucks cappuccinos. And Starbucks, of course, as an international symbol, is something that I can talk about, and everyone will, I think, understand how much that is. That is the difference in the typical consumer of cannabis and THC that we're talking about today. It's like somebody who drank a 20-ounce single-size serving of Coca-Cola, who now drinks 33 medium, or they call them grande, Starbucks cappuccinos. And I also use a coffee Starbucks analogy because Representative Davis is from the Seattle area, which of course is where Starbucks comes from. So I thought that was an apt analogy. But think about the difference there is really an incredible difference. And one thing that really does concern us, and it really should concern everybody here, because all of the countries here, you have experience, and I wish I could say experience in a good way, but we all have experience really not in a good way, of big tobacco and the influence of the global tobacco industry, which of course is the largest industry in the world in terms of, more than, I should say, larger than Starbucks. Now we're talking about Starbucks, larger than Microsoft, larger than Coca-Cola, larger than McDonald's combined. That's how large it is. And so we're very concerned that this industry of big tobacco is now taking over big marijuana. We have many front groups in the United States who act as public health stewards, but when you look at their funding, they say they're public health stewards, but you look at their funding, the funding comes from big tobacco and also big alcohol. And that is something we need to be concerned about. And by the way, if you want to hear more about that, you can go to our website, learnaboutsam.org. We have profiles on all of the major tobacco players that are now really in the cannabis business. And of course, it's not just traditional tobacco companies, it's also e-cigarette companies, which, by the way, they now call themselves harm reduction companies, the e-cigarette companies. And yes, while of course it is good and better for somebody who's addicted to tobacco nicotine cigarettes to move to e-cigarettes, we also know that these e-cigarette companies are marketing to youth and they're getting into the marijuana business. And that's something that we're concerned about. In the United States, this has translated to a rapid increase in daily users of marijuana. We have upwards of 15 million people in the United States daily using. That was versus less than 1 million in the early 1990s. And it really is following something we call the addiction for profit model. What is the addiction for profit model? The addiction for profit model is where you do not need everybody to use your addictive product in order to make money. You just need a minority of users who use the majority of your product. And they are really 80% of your sales is coming from 30% of the users. And so they are able to target those 30%, the people more apt to have a substance use disorder, those that are don't have the help around them, they don't have access to healthcare, housing, the things that are needed to not fall into and have the disease of a substance use disorder. And this is something that these industries target. They target folks. This is about addiction for profit. And it's why our US Surgeon General, who is a good friend, Dr. Vivek Murthy, talks about how marijuana is in fact addicted, and that the public policy, he said, is outpacing science. And so that's not a good thing. When public policy comes ahead of where the science is, and the science is actually saying something very different, then we have a real problem on our hands. And this is something we're very concerned about. We're concerned in our country about perpetuating social injustice, because the people that are getting rich from cannabis, let's be very frank, they look like people like me. They do not look like people like my friends James and Charmaine Hayes from Compton, California, who have to fight with everything they have to stop the influence, because they already have liquor stores, they already have tobacco outlets, nicotine, they already have lottery that is preying, and gambling that is preying on low-income communities. They don't want more things to keep their community from prospering in society, both materially and spiritually and emotionally and everything else. And so really, unfortunately, they have been targeting this. By the way, the arrest rates for cannabis after legalization are still disproportionately biased against people of color. So this idea that this will somehow, commercialization was supposed to help social justice, we have not seen happen. In fact, in many places like California, the most populous state in the United States, we have minority populations that are exposed to both licensed and unlicensed cannabis companies and retail outlets. And when you do the overlay of the census, you see that very starkly. Not even 4% of the national marijuana industry is Black owned. They are being shut out. So you can't even say that at least somehow they're prospering materially from this. They're not. The people prospering materially are people, again, that look a lot more like me than anybody else. And the underground market, and this is very important because I know many countries listening to us this morning who are here, they have a very big underground market, of course, for cannabis. That's the only market. And we're often told that if you have a regulated market, you'll get rid of the underground market. But in many states, we are seeing that actually that underground market is getting worse, not better. The New York Times, which is, by the way, endorses the legalization for social justice reasons, although I think they're wrong-headed on that, they openly admit that the underground market is getting worse, that there's an illegal pot market, for example, in a state like California, booming for many, many reasons. And by the way, the tax revenue, and maybe Representative Davis can tell us if, they're swimming in cash to give everybody, mental health care, housing, education from cannabis. I don't think any state is swimming in cash. It's less than 0.5% of the state budgets is where cannabis revenue, legal revenue, is coming to. So it's not even a big revenue source at all. And instead, we are seeing increases in hospitalizations from THC poisonings. We are seeing pesticide use. There have been undercover investigations from Oregon to Massachusetts talking about how states are failing to regulate this because, we have the Food and Drug Administration, which is the body overlooking medicine and food in the United States. Each state doesn't have an equivalent that is as robust and powerful as the FDA. And so it's very difficult for states to be able to properly be ahead of this industry. Instead, the industry is often ahead of these states. We've also had the impaired driving issue. Washington State, there was a study from AAA, which is, of course, the automobile club, which most countries have a version of. But we've seen that in other states, Oregon, Colorado, California. In fact, a recent study from British Columbia, Canada, finds that there has been a big increase in impaired driving due to cannabis. And so this is very worrisome. What does that mean that we do? Well, it doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And this is where Representative Davis comes in and is going to talk. But we can try at least and regulate some of the concentrates, regulate THC. Luke is going to talk about that as well in Colorado. We should do that. We should not allow the cannabis industry to be on rule-making bodies. They should not be governing themselves. We should not allow advertising for this. The United States has a very hard time stopping advertising, but of course, most other countries in the world, in fact, I think almost all, have abilities, of course, to prohibit the commercialization and advertising. We need a science-based public awareness campaign, and we need to make impaired driving a priority. If you have not legalized, which of course most countries haven't, we don't think you should go to prison for users. We don't think you should be stigmatized. We don't think this is something that should give you a criminal record. But we think, at the same time, we don't want to promote it. So removing the criminal records, expunging records, but we need to try and discourage marijuana use. A good example is speed limits. If you're driving over the speed limit, you will be cited. And the speed limit is meant to discourage speeding. That's why we have speed limits. Many people still speed, by the way, and they're fine. They don't get into a car crash. That's not a reason to get rid of speed limits, just because people use cannabis isn't a reason to get rid of cannabis laws. But if you are caught for speeding, your life is also usually, unless you were going way over, it's not ruined for life. And so, we have to make sure we don't push people towards an underground economy with our penalties either. So we have to watch that. But we still need a science-based awareness campaign. I think we need a global science-based awareness campaign. I think UNODC, I hope, can look into what we can do with our resources to have global, credible advertising campaigns and discouraging campaigns for our young people. If you want to learn more about all of this that I talked about today, you can go to learnaboutsam.org. We have a whole lessons learned document. But really, I'm very excited to hear about the state experiences in Washington and Colorado. So thank you for hearing me. I will throw it back to Luke, who will introduce Representative Davis.
Yes, Representative Davis, we got a really nice summary there from Dr. Sabet. So why don't you go ahead and take us on a travel through your state, your experience, and why you took up your potency cap legislation.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to join you both, and thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be in community with all of you this morning. So I am from the great state of Washington in the upper left of the United States, and I'll rewind quite a number of years here, actually to back when I was in high school. I graduated from high school in 2005. At the time when I was in high school in the state of Washington, my peers, some of them, bought black market cannabis, and it was 100% dried cannabis flower. That's all that there was available. And at the time, the potency of that black market cannabis was around between 5 and 8%. And fast forward 7 years after I graduated high school to 2012, and there was an initiative on the ballot, of Voters Initiative of the People, Initiative 502. And that initiative was to legalize marijuana in the state of Washington. And at that time in 2012, the potency of black market marijuana in the state was about 10%. And again, it was still just that dried flower cannabis. And here's what we know. So we know that the dried cannabis flower itself is biologically limited to about 30% potency. And we also know that the enacting initiative in Washington state, that initiative 502, limited the potency of edibles, your brownies and your cookies and your candies and your sodas, to 10%. But in an omission of just massive proportions, and it was really an omission due to sort of lack of imagination, there was no cap on concentrates of cannabis. And when I talk to people who were around at that time, they say that it was because nobody really imagined or envisioned what was possible and what was coming. And, fortunately, most of your countries haven't made the colossal mistake of legalizing marijuana. And I'm here to tell you and warn you what will happen if you do. So that initiative, essentially all of the propaganda associated with the initiative, basically said that if you want to undo racism, if you want to undo mass incarceration, you need to legalize marijuana. And that was a complete false dichotomy. There's a lot that you can do around the happy space that I live in, which is decriminalizing, right? So you're not putting people in a carceral system into cages for having a brain disorder, for having substance use disorder, but neither are you profiteering an addictive substance. And they were told that you have to go, the pendulum has to go from here to here. And people bought it. People of my demographic, young people, liberal people, Democrats, I fit all of those categories. Hook, line, and sinker, they bought this. And though I and others opposed, the initiative still passed. But we didn't actually legalize marijuana in the state of Washington. What we did is we commercialized THC. We commercialized a psychoactive chemical. And what happened is from 2012, you had a potency of 10%. The market actually started in 2014 is when those products became commercially available. And what came into my state was science and investors and industry. And what has grown out of that is just an explosion of cannabis concentrates. That what you find in these retail outlets, which are literally everywhere, you can't drive without seeing marijuana billboards in my state. You can't drive in my neighborhood or any city virtually without seeing, 1-800-WEED. And I mean, it's just absolutely heinous. And they're absolutely everywhere. So now these concentrates, these, dabs and hash and these, oils that you can put in these, essentially quite similar to a vape pen that a lot of our high school students are using to vape e-cigarettes and tobacco products. You can also vape these THC cartridges with these concentrates that are 99% THC, 99% psychoactive substances. So they're basically 10 times as potent as the stuff that the kids that my peer group when I was in high school were smoking. And when we talk about, a human experiment, we are quite literally experimenting on the brains of an entire generation of young people. We do not fully understand and comprehend what happens to the human brain, particularly the developing brain that's not fully developed until age 25, when you are infusing that with such a highly potent narcotic at that age. There's a researcher in my state that has compared cannabis concentrates. She says they're as similar to the marijuana flower as strawberries are to frosted strawberry Pop-Tarts. Now, I don't know if you all sell Pop-Tarts in every country that's represented here this morning, but basically they are so purified and so concentrated that they no longer at all resemble this natural plants that was sort of peddled. So what has happened since 2014 when this became legal in my state and the stores opened? We have seen really three major health impacts of cannabis concentrates. Number one, psychosis. So we are seeing just an absolute epidemic of people, particularly young people, but not exclusively young people, who are presenting with first episode psychosis that is caused by the use of cannabis concentrates. Now, what's really concerning is when they present to the emergency department, the initial diagnosis is cannabis-induced psychosis. But 50% of them, 1 in 2, will have a fully fledged schizophrenia diagnosis within 8 years. So here's what we know about the brain and psychosis. Each of us, Luke and Kevin and myself, we all have a threshold for developing a psychotic disorder. Everybody carries that. And what happens when you, while we don't totally understand the science, what we know is that cannabis concentrates basically hurdle somebody over that threshold. They sort of lower the threshold such that a person who may never have developed a psychotic disorder otherwise suddenly becomes psychotic. And when we talk about just a massive increase in the percentage of people who are going to have a schizophrenia diagnosis, that is significant. That is a debilitating disorder. People die 25 years younger. There's no known cure. People die of suicide. They also die of the metabolic syndrome caused by the antipsychotics people take. The quality of life is diminished. That's a huge strain on the economy and healthcare services and our disability lifeline and our welfare services in the state. Like, we are creating an entire generation that's going to have a much higher incidence of severe psychosis, and it's wholly preventable. And we're not doing anything about it. So that's the biggest impact, I would say, is the mental health impacts. We also are seeing a huge incidence of cannabis use disorder, because guess what? When you concentrate the heck out of something, it's much more addictive than the dried flower that kids smoked when I was in high school. And cannabis has always been addictive, but the concentrates are significantly more likely to produce someone developing a fully fledged cannabis use disorder. And then the third impact is something called CHS, or cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, basically cyclic vomiting associated with the concentrates. Cannabis is actually antiemetic. It prevents you from vomiting when it's used at a lower dose. So like dried flower, they'll use it in some cases for appetite stimulation and nausea suppression for chemo patients. But when you use it at these really high concentrated doses, it has an inverse effect, and it actually causes vomiting, cyclic vomiting. And there was a young man in the state of Washington who died from that. He was in his 30s and died of a stroke because of CHS. People are presenting to the hospital with this mysterious cyclic vomiting, and it's 100% caused by cannabis concentrates. So that is what we're seeing. We're seeing high school administrators going to the parking lot of their school, and they are finding 16-year-old high school sophomores who had no previous mental health history, who have used a vape pen with a THC cartridge, who are in full-blown psychosis. And they're calling their parents, rushing the child to the emergency department, and the kid is being diagnosed with THC-induced psychosis and a prognosis of a 50% chance of developing a psychotic disorder within 8 years. I mean, it's really quite significant. So in response to this really quiet epidemic that nobody is talking about, I've twice introduced legislation to actually cap the potency of cannabis concentrates in the state of Washington. The first year I introduced a 10% potency cap, and my logic there was really to equate it with the cap on edibles. The cap on edibles is 10% in Washington state. And so I thought, to me, it was, I'm a politician, so it was a starting point for negotiation. I didn't necessarily think we would end there. Most of our concentrates in the state of Washington are between 60 and 99% potency. So I introduced that, I was called all sorts of names. I was called reefer madness. I was called, ultra conservative. I'm actually one of the most progressive lawmakers in the Washington state legislature, and I represent a very progressive district. So I was met with fierce, response from basically people who use marijuana. And then I was met with the industry, and I reached out to the industry and told them I was introducing this legislation, and not a single person from the Washington state cannabis industry had actually ever heard that there was any nexus with cannabis use and psychotic disorder. So then I got them well acquainted with the huge volume of literature on the subject, and they pledged to me, we don't like your cannabis potency cap, Rep. Davis, but we're going to work with you in earnest because what you've identified is a genuine public health problem. So I was expecting them to kind of honor their word in good faith, but that's actually not what happened. So fast forward 6 months after I introduced this legislation, the Washington State House Commerce and Gaming Committee, which is our committee that oversees point of sale issues for cannabis, had a work session. And you better believe that one after the other, every cannabis lobbyist filed in, and they testified that cannabis does not cause psychosis. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted. And so if I may quote, back in 1957, there was a tobacco industry director named Clarence Cook who testified before Congress stating, "No one has established that cigarette smoke or any of its known constituents is cancer causing to man." So the tobacco industry's first move out of their playbook was to deny the link with cancer, right, to our federal lawmaking body. So that happened. And then they're basically following the exact same playbook. So first we're going to deny it. And then the second move they used was out of the opioid industry's playbook. The opioid industry didn't want to identify that opioids were causal. And so what they said, Purdue Pharma was quoted saying that opioid addiction is not caused by drugs. It is triggered in a susceptible individual by exposure to drugs. So they tried to use this sort of susceptible individual theory. Well, the cannabis industry in this work session, to my peers in the Washington state legislature, also tried to use the susceptible individual theory and say, oh no, cannabis doesn't cause psychosis. It's people who had a predisposition, a family history of schizophrenia. They're the ones who are developing it. And that theory has been completely debunked by studies, family studies, twin studies. It's actually the cannabis concentrates themselves that are causing the psychosis. And that's very well established. And it's really quite settled science. So, the big issue that I face is that not a single legislator, there's 147 of us in the Washington state legislature, 49 senators, and there's 98 of us in the House. And I wrote a pretty scathing op-ed, actually, where I compared the Washington state cannabis industry to the tobacco industry and to Purdue Pharma. And I quoted chapter and verse, and I sent it to every one of my colleagues. And I got amazing response from my colleagues in the legislature. But the number one response I got was, Lauren, I had no idea. I had no idea what they were selling in these stores. I had no idea what it was doing to our children. I had no idea what it was doing to the developing brain. And it's basically this silent evil. And the problem is, not only did my colleagues in the legislature not know, and to be clear, they were very supportive, and many of them were moved to act upon being aware of what I had shared, but the general public doesn't know at all. There's no connection in their brain at all for these parents who have adolescents, for these parents who have a child under the age of 25, in particular with a developing brain. They have no idea what their children are using and the potential link with psychotic disorder. It's sort of like, I don't know about other countries, but in the United States, you cannot walk around and not be aware that there is a link between drinking alcohol while pregnant and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Every single restaurant has a little sticker, every single bar that has an image of a pregnant woman talking about how the impairing effects of alcohol on the developing fetus. So while people still may make a choice to drink while pregnant, nobody would ever argue that they didn't know what the consequences were. The public is very aware that there's a nexus between those two things, but the public has no idea that there is a nexus between cannabis concentrates and psychotic disorder. And yet it's happening in every community in my state. It's happening in other states. We're all going through the same crisis. And it's a huge problem, and people are not moved to act because they don't even know the problem exists. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen until we can kind of build the social will. So far, I have not prevailed in my legislation. The cannabis lobby is very strong. They contribute lots of money to my colleagues' political campaigns. They, they argue that they're, small businesses, and, we're just supporting small businesses. And so they definitely have a lot of support, and they are in fact a powerful lobby. But I do have a lot of hope, actually, that as the education increases, that we will be able to prevail and try to undo. But what I would just offer to all of you is it is a hell of a lot easier to stop this nightmare before it happens in your country than it is to try to put, once you've opened Pandora's box, it's really hard to put that back. And that's the argument the industry makes, is that if you put it back, then everyone is just going to, create cannabis concentrates in their garage, and they're going to be using butane oil, and they're going to blow up their garage, and there's going to be garage fires everywhere. And you're going to push all the cannabis concentrates to the black market. Well, guess what? We didn't really have cannabis concentrates in the black market before we allowed profit and science and investors to come into our state and destroy it with cannabis concentrates. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Representative Davis, thank you for that wonderful narrative of just your experience, what's going on in the state, the industry, and really the mental health problems associated with high potency marijuana, which really, you talked about the increased mental health issues, psychosis and all that, and the addiction issues. And that really was the impetus for what happened in Colorado this last year. So for those of you who may not be aware, Colorado was the first state in the country to pass a major marijuana regulatory overhaul last year. Now, our organization was a part of the leadership of the coalition of organizations that got that across the finish line in the state. And basically what we were setting out to do was to cap the potency of marijuana in Colorado, because right now it's completely unlimited. It's unlimited in basically every state, except for a couple states I'm going to mention a little bit later. But it was completely unlimited. We thought we should, try to fight for a limit. And really where it started was with families, in particular moms. One mother named Laura Stack, whose son, Johnny, unfortunately was addicted to dabbing marijuana, developed a series of mental illness complications that concluded with him jumping off of a parking garage just last year, tragically passing away. Laura and her husband, John Stack, actually have now formed an organization called Johnny's Ambassadors. And so they started about a year ago on the heels of our big move in Colorado. And it was Laura and a couple of other moms who came together in the state of Colorado, whose kids either were addicted or died by suicide related to marijuana or had some other connection. All the kids were either dabbing marijuana, which if you don't know what dabbing is all the craze now in our youth. We're seeing it's a way to use incredibly high potency marijuana in a very fast way to get high very quickly. It's highly addictive, highly dangerous process. But all of our youth are getting into that now in Colorado and other legal states. But these moms came together and they said, we've got to do something about this. So they started to speak, testify. They got several features on the news in Colorado. They got some national coverage. Laura Stack was featured in People magazine, a large magazine here in America. Lots and lots of coverage around this. And there was legislation that was put forward. But the industry, the marijuana industry, is the third largest lobbying presence in the state of Colorado. They have over 100 lobbyists in the state capitol. And to give you perspective, we're just a state of about 4 million people. So very large outsized presence for what is really one of the smaller states in terms of population in the country. So the lobby brought out all the stops. They were able to stop the potency cap measure in its tracks. That was completely a non-starter. But we continued forward with regulations on the medical marijuana program. We actually, now the state, we were able to pass this legislation. What we ended up doing was there's a warning handout that's now given to every medical marijuana patient that says if you're taking high potency marijuana, these are the psychosis risks, these are other mental illness risks. So it was a very big public health victory on that front. Even though we didn't get the potency cap, we were able to get some science-based warning labels and messages, which were really good. We're going to be continuing that effort this year in Colorado and in ensuing years. And these moms and parents, unfortunately, they're multiplying. And I think that's one of the concerning signs that we're seeing right now in this trend toward legalization is you see lawmakers and governments willing to open Pandora's box, as Representative Davis so eloquently stated, open Pandora's box. And then they really only realize the problem when people start losing their lives. And it's at what point, how many lives need to be lost in order for that message to be heard loud and clear that there's a problem. So that's really the concern about rushing into legalization, is doing that. It didn't just stop with Colorado and Washington, though. So there were movements to, there's a movement to cap potency in both of our states, but now we're seeing that in other states. So the state of Vermont capped potency of concentrates at 60%. Connecticut went ahead and did the same thing. So those became the first two states to have concentrate potency caps in place. We're seeing a number of other states that have chosen to legalize the drug in America. They are now pushing for potency caps, and it's being led by parents, by families. That's really where we're seeing this get driven. So it's rather unfortunate because it's being really brought to attention, brought to light by people losing their lives and getting into addiction. But we are finally starting to see some progress on that front. So I think that's a key piece of this, is understanding the public health harm of this policy and really having a chance to fully vet the science. This new high potency of marijuana that Representative Davis was talking about, and what we see in Colorado too, we didn't have that in the black market. As she said, we have that now. We only have about 5 years where the research has really started to come out in earnest on what these new formulations do to the human brain, what they do to public health. So we need a lot more time to understand this. It makes a lot more sense to not advance commercialization policies, maybe for another few decades, until we have a final scientific answer on what this drug does to the brain, what the mental health impacts are at scale, at a population level. And then, with that full scientific understanding, then having a more educated approach to commercialization, if that's something down the road that may or may not make sense. So I think that's a key point that I wanted to make. Kevin, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We can begin our roundtable discussion here.
Sure, thanks. And we see some of the questions here, and I think most of the people, they should type their question in where should they type it?
We'll answer your questions in the chat box. So go ahead and type your questions in the chat box as we're discussing. We'll get right back to you in the chat box.
Yeah, and there were some other questions that came in, but what I was gonna just say is that, first of all, thank you. It's fascinating from both of you. Representative Davis, maybe you can talk a little bit more. You touched on sort of the industry influence, and it must be an interesting place to be, a progressive Democrat, sort of being called a prohibitionist, sort of, Nancy Reagan moral crusader. I don't think you've ever been called that in any other context, but just in this context. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that influence, because I think that is fascinating. It's, in one respect, it's a uniquely American, I think, feature of legalization. But frankly, we have been seeing reports from Germany, for example, as they move forward with their new, with the sort of post-Merkel Germany new coalition government led by the left. We have been seeing and hearing about influence of the marijuana industry even there to write the regulation. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what that experience has been and how you have navigated those waters. I think that would help some folks on today.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that their influence is extraordinary. We're a state of about 7.6 million people. So we're a little bit larger than Colorado. We don't have 100 marijuana lobbyists. We do have plenty more than our fair share. It's been interesting. So a lot of the people that got into the marijuana industry early, I would say there were two groups. One group was it was a lot of people that looked like Kevin and Luke. It was white men, and it was particularly wealthy white men who actually saw this as an investment opportunity. They had no interest they didn't use cannabis. They had no interest in cannabis culture. They were very interested in profiteering off of this. So that was sort of group number one. And then the second category was people that were actually in the illicit cannabis industry previously. And so there's sort of two different lobbying groups that have grown up in the state of Washington. One primarily composed of people who were in the illicit cannabis market previously, who maybe have less of the sort of the business savvy. And then you have the group that is the more professionalized, polished cannabis lobby. But interestingly, only about 10 to 20% of the cannabis industry is actually represented by either group. So most of the cannabis industry is actually sort of rogue. They still show up on legislation, but they're not walking in sync. They're not necessarily singing from the same sheet of music. Frankly, they'd probably be more powerful if they didn't fight amongst themselves. But even the two groups that I mentioned frequently end up on opposite sides of an issue. We just had an issue with Delta-8 cannabinoids in the state of Washington, where the pro-business kind of cannabis group wanted to commercialize those, and the original, folks who were in the cannabis industry previously did not. So that's kind of the landscape of the cannabis industry in our state. Again, they play heavily in electoral politics, and that I wish I could say that didn't matter, but it certainly has influence. And part of it is actually a structural issue. So every governing body is different. In Washington state, we refer bills to particular committees, and if your bill can't get out of a particular committee, it will die. Now, if the bills that I was writing around a potency cap were actually going to, let's say, the Washington State House of Representatives Healthcare Committee, we would have had the votes, and it's entirely possible the bill would be law by now. But they go to a committee that is in the people that seated on that committee are people who accept campaign contributions from this industry and who are interested in this industry as sort of an economic engine. There's not a single public health person with one iota of public health experience who sits on the committee that rules on these issues in the state of Washington. So that's kind of a structural issue that may or may not be unique to my state, but I think it's important for people to think about. And that allows the lobbyists to have incredible power, because if they can kill a bill in committee, even if the majority of the House of Representatives would vote for it, if it never makes it out of committee, it'll never be brought up for a vote on the floor, and the bill will perpetually die. So kind of lots of interesting quirks and dynamics. But in general, I would say, one opportunity here is to try to peel off people from the industry. So I've had several people from the industry kind of quietly reach out to me and say, hey, I think you're actually onto something. I think our products maybe are causing psychosis, and maybe we should have a conversation. One of the groups, since testifying at the work session that I mentioned, that cannabis does not cause psychosis, they've subsequently changed their position and are now no longer arguing that it doesn't cause psychosis, and they've sort of stepped down and kind of backed out of that conversation. Those are actually the cannabis growers in Washington state. So there is some fracturing in the industry, which actually somebody like me could potentially take advantage of that fracturing, because they're not all in sync. But it's a complicated landscape. They have an incredible amount of power. It does generate a decent amount of money in the state of Washington, more than actually was originally projected. Not nearly enough, not even close to overcome or compensate for the harms that it's causing. I mean, it's night and day. But there's a lot of interest in this industry, and there's a lot of desire to, again, support it as the economics, while totally ignoring the public health implications. The industry also has outsized influence in our regulatory body. So our Liquor and Cannabis Board, the industry just wines and dines, the staff, and I mean, it's really quite grotesque.
No, that winding and dining is a feature of American lobbying, unfortunately. It's and again, we're seeing this internationally too. I don't know, Luke, if you wanted to comment on anything related to the Colorado industry influence.
Yeah, well, what we've seen is, the industry really, so yes, so I will tell you, so the head of our marijuana regulatory regime, who ultimately is strategically in charge of it here in Colorado, he's our pot czar. He is a marijuana CEO who sold his marijuana company. It's several string of pot shops, and he sold that so that he could then take this position in government. So he is responsible for all of our regulations. And so one paper wrote that it was kind of like making the Marlboro man the head of the FDA. Or maybe, the CEO of Pfizer as the head of the FDA or something like that. So not the direction we want to go. We have a lot of industry influence on these regulatory boards. But what we're also seeing, setting the influence aside, we're seeing very, very aggressive campaigns to discredit families who are coming forward. So you had some very aggressive rhetoric from this industry in Colorado, particularly as the moms were coming forward and giving their experience with their children. And the industry was very intimidating towards them. And there was a lot of PR around that, that we saw public relations campaigns on that, et cetera. So unfortunately, we're seeing, and Representative Davis astutely noted this earlier about how the marijuana industry is following the tobacco industry playbook, who's following the opioid industry playbook. You're seeing these claims being made and then attempts to discredit the people who are speaking up about the harms and the problems. And with the opioid industry particularly, there was one little paragraph of a scientific review. It wasn't even a study that said, perhaps only 2% of people using opioids get addicted. And that was cited heavily by the industry and kind of used to shut down any concerns. And we're seeing a lot of that play out with some of the research that comes out now. You have Altria, which is a new name for Philip Morris. They have partnered with Constellation Brands, a large conglomerate of alcohol, to start what's really leading the federal effort to legalize marijuana in America. So they're one of the leading groups lobbying for this now. And just this week, they put out a study, just like tobacco did back in the day, their bogus studies to undermine the science. They just put out a study saying, youth use of marijuana is going down in states that legalized it. And they're pushing this out this week. And that's from a group that's completely comprised of tobacco, alcohol, and other such companies. So we are seeing an organization level, not unlike what we saw with tobacco, not unlike what we saw with opioids. And with the opioid cases, those cases are playing out as we speak. And we're seeing a lot of the claims are very similar to what the claims are being made by this industry.
Yeah, and we hear a lot about revenue. We don't hear as much, and correct me if I'm wrong, about counting the costs, because of course we should acknowledge revenue coming in. I mean, there is some revenue coming in. When you legalize anything and you tax anything, by default, it means revenue comes in. So of course that happens. Just like, on a hot summer day, if I have a lemonade stand in my neighborhood, my kid will be able to get some revenue from that. She will sell some lemonade, right? But it would also behoove us, and I wouldn't be this harsh to my 2-year-old, but to also count the costs, right? So if my 2-year-old said, well, we also want to buy, the best organic fresh lemons flown in from Naples, Italy, the night before, and we're going to pay for the overnight customs and the fees, well, if that's costing me $50,000 for, to bring in those lemons, and I'm selling $5,000 worth of lemonade, which would be great, that's not really a great business. Might be worth doing because it makes my 2-year-old happy, but from an adult business perspective, not a great business. But that's because we would be counting the costs of importing those lemons. I don't see anybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, counting. We have tried to do it, but we're not an economic organization, but counting the costs of, driving, for example, it costs about we can predict for an impaired car crash for everybody involved in a car crash. It could cost, if they're injured, about $1 million in total costs. So there's $1 million there. The cost of hospital admissions, the cost of tardiness of school, if you miss school, we not even thinking about lost productivity, which is its own equation. But I don't really see anybody do it. I mean, I don't know, Representative Davis, please tell me I missed something here and I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong here, that there's somebody and some groups counting the costs so you can do cost revenue calculations.
Certainly not in my state, tragically. And so that's the thing. The only thing that's being counted is the revenue, and the only thing that people see are what is counted. And so they see, these green dollar signs, but they're not seeing, this mother holding her child with cyclic vomiting, who's presenting to the emergency department every week for this uncontrolled cyclic vomiting and the dehydration it causes. They're not seeing the presentations for first episode psychosis or suicidality associated with cannabis use. They're not seeing the cost to the state Medicaid system for admissions for cannabis use disorder, for inpatient substance use disorder treatment. They're not seeing, the costs associated with a schizophrenia diagnosis alone, and the number that's going to be increased, that is a lifelong debilitating diagnosis. For one individual, the costs associated with that on, again, our welfare models in our state, for cash assistance, for housing assistance, for repeated emergency department visits, repeated psychiatric hospitalizations, psychiatric medications are just extraordinary. And no one is paying attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And Luke, I think there was an institute in Colorado that did try to do that, but
that's correct. Yeah. So the only cost report that we are aware of in America is a 92-page study done a couple of years ago by the Centennial Institute. They didn't have all the data inputs they asked for from the state and from the various agencies that handle these things, but their all-in estimate was that the state of Colorado spends $4.50 on costs for every $1 in marijuana tax revenue. That's really it keeps in line with the trend we've seen with other vice drugs, such as tobacco, which we know we lose $10 or more in social costs for every $1 in tobacco tax revenue. So it's not surprising that we're seeing that kind of a dynamic at play, and we really need to look at that. So we are right at time. So we're going to wrap up our time. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and giving us your time to talk about these important issues. I want to thank Representative Davis, the odd hours of the night for you and for us, but we thank you for joining us today to share your perspective and keep up the courageous and incredible fight that you are putting on in your state. And Dr. Sabet as well, I want to thank you for joining us to give us kind of a summary of the issues and really that perspective. And for me from Colorado, it's a pleasure to be able to share the experience from my state as well, with so many of you joining us virtually from countries all over the world. So our organization stands with you and is here to be a resource to you as decision makers as you encounter issues around marijuana and commercialization. So if you'd like to get in touch with us, please head over to our website, learnaboutsam.org. I'll also make sure I have our email here typed in the chat, but you can contact us, contact myself, Luke, at learnaboutsam.org. We are happy to help you with any questions or any data that you may need. So with that being said, Representative Davis, Dr. Sabet, thank you very much for your time today.
thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.